Part 1. The marker no one is talking about while you were watching the news last week. While life felt normal and routine, something ancient began moving in plain sight. Not in secret, not in theory, but across continents, through economic decisions, political realignments, and global shifts that most people casually label as just how the world works. But what's happening right now is not random. December 2025, not just another month on the calendar. It functions as a marker, one many scholars skim past and many churches avoid mentioning, not because it's unclear, but because it points to a transfer of influence that challenges long-standing assumptions about power. And prophecy does not wait for permission. For centuries, historical processes, especially during colonial eras, changed names, rewrote textbooks, and reshaped theology through selective translation and emphasis. Identities were blurred, narratives were adjusted, people were encouraged to forget who they were and to stop asking dangerous questions. But God's promises do not expire because humans attempt to bury them. Prophecy has its own timeline, and right now that timeline is accelerating. We are watching biblical prophecy unfold in real time, while the media calls it politics, economists call it market shifts, and many religious leaders remain quietly silent. By the end of this journey, you will never look at scripture or current events the same way again. Part 2. The verse you were never taught to slow down on Let's Open Scripture without the filter you inherited. Not to attack the church, but to ask an honest question. Who decided which verses would be emphasized and which ones would quietly disappear from sermons? Start with Psalm 68:31. Princes shall come out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto Persia. Read quickly. It sounds harmless. But slow it down. This psalm was written around 1000 BC, roughly 3,000 years ago. It speaks forward to a future moment when African nations, named specifically Egypt and Ethiopia, moved toward God with urgency. The Hebrew word translated as soon does not mean eventually. It carries the idea of rushing forward with purpose. When it happens decisively. And when you read the surrounding verses of Psalm 68, you notice something else. This is not soft devotional poetry. It is coronation language. God rising, enemies scattering, kingdoms bringing tribute, authority being redistributed. This is power transfer language. So ask yourself, when was the last time you heard a sermon centered on this verse? Why are some prophecies highlighted endlessly while others are treated as footnotes? Sometimes silence is not accidental. Part 3, a pattern hidden in plain sight. Psalm 68 is not standing alone. Jeremiah speaks judgment over Egypt, but then promises restoration, describing a future return to stability and strength. That is not annihilation language. That is renewal language. When Jeremiah himself is in danger, it is an Ethiopian man, Ebed-Melech, who acts with courage while Judah's leaders hesitate. God then speaks protection over him. Scripture repeatedly presents African figures as morally decisive and spiritually perceptive. Isaiah 18 describes Cush, ancient Ethiopia, not as weak or inferior, but as a powerful people, feared far and wide. And it points toward a future moment when gifts are brought to Zion, not as tribute from slaves, but as offerings from equals. Zephaniah 3:10 continues the same thread. From beyond the rivers of Cush, worshipers bring offerings. Covenant language, identity language. These are not isolated verses. They form a consistent prophetic pattern. Africa is not portrayed as cursed or secondary. African nations and people are woven directly into the biblical story of restoration and authority. Which raises a difficult question. If the pattern has always been there, why were so many people never taught to see it? Part 4. 5 signs happening right now. If prophecy is unfolding, it should leave fingerprints in the present. And it does. First, global economic realignment. An alliance originally formed to challenge Western financial dominance expands, and 2 nations named together in Psalm 68 step into that alignment. Second, continental unity. African nations begin negotiating as a collective rather than as fragmented states. Unity, biblically, always precedes restoration. Third, resource leverage. The minerals powering the future of technology and energy sit largely in African soil, and the terms of extraction are changing. Princes do not negotiate from desperation. Fourth, demographic destiny. Africa holds the youngest population on Earth. Prophecy often moves through generations. The builders are rarely the same ones who suffered the exile. Fifth, cultural and spiritual awakening. Across the continent, in the diaspora, people are reclaiming history, identity, and scripture with fresh eyes. This does not happen by accident. It happens when timing aligns. All 5 signs are unfolding simultaneously. Not someday. Now. Part 5. Why this knowledge was suppressed. If this pattern was always in Scripture, why did it remain buried for so long? Because oppression is never only physical. It is narrative. Before ships ever sailed, a story had to be built. One that made injustice appear righteous. Certain biblical texts were twisted, especially in Genesis 9, to create theological justification for enslavement. But nowhere does Scripture say dark skin is a curse or that an entire lineage was destined for slavery. That interpretation was invented centuries later to excuse what could not be defended honestly. And systems enforced it practically, banning literacy, restricting worship, erasing language and heritage. Because if people read Scripture for themselves, they might notice that God consistently sides with the oppressed. But there was a flaw in the plan. You can rename people, you can rewrite textbooks, but you cannot stop time. Prophecy waits, and then it moves. Part 6. The acceleration phase. The dam began cracking in the 20th century. Independence movements surged. Civil rights movements rose. Cultural identity resurfaced. The illusion of permanence broke. Then the internet shattered the gatekeeping system entirely. Information could no longer be controlled. People found research that had existed for decades but was never taught. Communities connected across continents. Questions multiplied. At the same time, Africa began advancing quietly in technology, finance, diplomacy, and trade coordination. The charity narrative weakened as reality contradicted it. When narratives collapse, truth finds oxygen. Part 7. What biblical power transfer actually looks like. This is where misunderstanding often creeps in. Biblical power transfer is not revenge. It is restoration. Joseph rose, and nations were saved, including those who betrayed him. That is the pattern. When God restores the oppressed, it stabilizes the world rather than destroying it. Justice is not scarcity-based. It expands capacity. So if you were taught that empowerment requires someone else's displacement, you were taught a lie. God's economy does not work that way. The shift happening now threatens only systems built on injustice. For everyone else, it is an invitation. Part 8. Your role in this moment. If you are part of the African diaspora or the continent, hear this clearly. Slavery is not your primary identity. You are descendants of builders, leaders, survivors, and kingdom makers. Awakening is not accidental. It is timed. If you are watching from elsewhere and still feel drawn in, that also matters. This moment is not about guilt. It is about responsibility. So do more than watch. Study deeper. Build community. Invest intentionally. Teach the next generation. Pray for unity without pride and power without arrogance. Walk in truth. Walk in peace. Walk in power. You are not who the system said you were. You are who God says you are. And the season we are living in demands that you act like it.